what is longer than the length of 3 football fields, is 200 years old and made of animal skin. It's the longest act in the archives at UK Parliament. The Act's real title is the Land Tax Commissioners Act, 1821. It is 348 metres long, so long it has to be kept rolled up. It could take 10 to 15 minutes to walk from end to end and back again. It's so long that when it needs to be fully opened, it can take 2 people the whole day to unroll it, or roll it back again. So what makes the longest act so special? And what are acts? And what makes them important?
So an Act of Parliament is a law. So before a law becomes a law, it is debated in the House of Parliament. So that means that both members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons have a chance to input and decide whether a law should become a law. So very important to our democracy and legislative scrutiny.
Land tax was a tax on land, property and personal property, collected between 1693 and 1963. The House of Commons appointed men in England, Scotland and Wales to collect this tax in their areas. They were known as commissioners. All the commissioners' names are listed in the Act, about 65,000 people. What's interesting is that the tax wasn't collected by government officials. The people chosen to do the job were lords and professionals such as doctors and lawyers. Well-off merchants were also included. So the very people who would be paying most of the tax would be responsible for collecting it from other people like themselves, and they would not get paid to do the job. There's something else that's revealing about the Land Tax Commissioners Act. No women were given the job of collecting the taxes. Where is the Act kept and who looks after it?
So the Land Tax Act is kept in the Victoria Tower, which is part of the Palace of Westminster. That tower has 12 floors of archival storage space, keeps over 3 million records. We have over 60,000 rolled Acts of Parliament. So they take up a huge amount of space, as you can imagine. There's around 40 members of staff at the Parliamentary Archives, but it is our conservators that spend most of their time making sure that the records are kept safely and securely.
So why is the Act made of animal skin? Up until 1850, Acts of Parliament were written by hand on parchment called membranes. These pieces of animal skin were stitched together to make longer documents and stored as scrolls. Parchment is much stronger than paper, so these acts can survive for hundreds of years. Think of leather that's used in shoes. Parchment is the same material, but used in a different way. As the longest act in the archives at Parliament, it would have taken many months to create. What does it tell us about Parliament and how it works?
You can tell it's an Act of Parliament by looking out for certain things. So one thing is Norman French. So Norman French used to be the language of the court. There's a couple of phrases that are written on an Act by hand still to this day that mean that it is achieved royal assent and it is now an Act of Parliament. The most common one is Le Roy le Veut, which means the King wishes it, or Le Reine le Veut, which means the Queen wishes it. On the Land Tax Act, it's really interesting because it's got 2 pieces of Norman French written on it. One basically saying that it is passed from one house to the other, so as in it's passed from the House of Commons to the House of Lords for them to take a look at it. And then another one underneath that saying that they've accepted the amendments, which is actually 2 quite unusual bits of formula. So a lot more unusual than our regular Acts of Parliament. In 1999 it was proposed that the Parliament stopped printing Acts of Parliament on animal skin as a cost-saving measure. There was a bit of a pushback from that in terms of would the paper kind of stand up and be as hardy as the parchment. So it took a number of years for that to be decided, but from 2015 onwards we now have the records printed on archival paper.
The Land Tax Commissioners Act 1821 is an important piece of history. That's why it needs to be preserved. It's the job of conservators to keep it in good condition. But if it's made with tough animal skin, why does it need to be looked after?
We need to spend time conserving it because it's not only what we see that we fix, it is what we cannot see and requires our attention. The damages that take place within the skin and the deterioration that takes place within the skin that we are interested. And these things you can't see until it's too late. So our job is to make sure that we have enough time to address those risks and do something about it. The tools that we use in conservation are very similar to dentist tools. So we need small, precise instruments to help us work. Light, which is very important, that comes in different forms. So we're using light sheets, we're using torches. We also use magnification, and again, it could be holding a magnifying glass like an inspector or putting it under a microscope. We can see all sorts of things when we put it under the microscope. And we do like to explore our equipment based on different cultures. So we use a lot of tools from Japan, we use a lot of tools from the Western world. We're trying to find the best, more appropriate tool to treat our artwork and our collections. When you're examining the parchment, you can see the follicles of the skin, of the hair. You can see the way that the parchment was scraped and treated. You can also see the veins of the animal. Oh, to hold and handle something like that is feel like a baby, a quite big, chubby baby. Flimsy, not very stable. You have to hold it in a specific way. You have to be very careful not to drop it, and it's heavy.
Parchment is already preserved skin, so it was actually chemically treated and dried out and stretched. That's why it's got its unique qualities. The important thing for the documents is also that actually the information on the parchment can be scraped and then corrected. So also on the longest act you can see a lot of corrections that were made during transcribing the act. The qualities the conservator needs is curiosity, patience, and also a steady hand. And by curiosity, I mean being curious about how your object was made, where is it coming from, whether it's old, what's the science of it, how it was made. So to be curious and to understand your object before you do anything to it. That's the most important thing. The longest act, if well looked after, will survive another 2,000 or 4,000 years, not only hundreds.
UK Parliament has been making and changing the law for nearly 1,000 years and continues to do so today. Acts of Parliament are important for all of us. They contain the laws of the UK, the rules we all live by, and they change lives. It's only because of the 1944 Education Act that every child is entitled to free secondary school education. Until this act was passed, most children left school by the age of 14. That's why acts matter. They change our laws and our rights, so it's important they're kept safe. They're just no longer made with animal skin. But why are acts and Parliament relevant to young people who are not old enough to vote?
I hope young people think that Parliament and acts are relevant to them. I can understand why it might seem quite distant and quite far away from their everyday life, but I think Parliament is a way for people to influence change, and the more people engage with Parliament, the more influence that you have. And it's just learning about those ways and thinking about, actually, if Parliament's not relevant to you, how can you make it relevant to you?